Hello and welcome. When I first came to live in the Chester area just a couple of years ago, I knew the name St Werburgh from a street sign and recognised that it was Anglo-Saxon, but it was a surprise to learn that she was a female saint and that there was a pilgrim shrine dedicated to her in the former abbey, now the cathedral. So who was the Anglo-Saxon St Werburgh? Where was she from? Why did she become central to worship in Chester long after her death? What is the geese in a basket theme all about on her pilgrim badges? And what role did the Shrine of St Werburgh play in the economic life of Chester St Werburgh Abbey? First, let's have a look at the idea of pilgrim badges and what they represented to those who bought them at pilgrim shrines like St Werburgh's. Had you been a pilgrim in the Middle Ages, undertaking a journey to Chester to visit the miracle-performing shrine of St Werburgh, you might have been tempted to buy yourself a pilgrim's badge, to commemorate a job well done, and to communicate your achievement to others. Most importantly, however, you would have had the opportunity to touch that badge to the saint's shrine in order to absorb some of the saint's divine power into the badge itself, which could be dipped into drinking water to be swallowed as a cure or rubbed onto an injury as a salve. That's what you're looking at on this slide, a pilgrim's badge associated with the Abbey of St Werburgh, which would have been sold to pilgrims either as they arrived in the town or as they left via the inevitable gift shop. The British Museum purchased the badge in 1836 from a dealer in medals and coins called Harry Cureton. Its travels between the time of its manufacture to its purchase by a dealer before being accessioned into the British Museum's collections is lost, but its story is embedded in other much older histories. It captures the actions of the Anglo-Saxon queen who moved the saint from Staffordshire to Chester in the 10th century, and the subsequent centuries of pilgrim visits to the abbey to experience Werburgh for themselves. Badges and ampulla like these were associated with many of the major shrines and could be added to an existing personal collection, representing the piety implied by so many pilgrimages, sometimes a signal of the many discomforts or difficulties that had been overcome to enable a pilgrimage to be successfully completed. Werburgh was born a Mercian princess in around AD 650. Her father was Wulfhere, king of Mercia, and her mother was Ermengild, who became a nun on the death of Wulfhere, first at Minster in Sheppey and then at Ely, where she succeeded her mother Sigsburg as abbess. In Anglo-Saxon Britain before the 8th century, Mercia occupied the Midlands and much of the surrounding areas, including Chester. This period is sometimes referred to as a heptarchy, referring to the fact that 7 kingdoms are identifiable at this time. Werburgh was educated at home by Chad, who became Bishop of Lichfield. Although St Werburgh is depicted in a couple of the stained glass windows in the cathedral, these are modern, romanticised visualisations. There are no contemporary depictions, and apart from having an idea of what she may have worn, her appearance is unknown. Medieval accounts of her life probably incorporate older material, but almost certainly include quite a bit of myth and conjecture as well. On the death of her father, who was succeeded by her uncle, Werburgh went as a nun to the convent of Ely founded by her great-aunt Aethelfaed. Werburgh obviously proved her worth because her uncle eventually asked Werburgh to take charge of and organise nunneries in the Midlands, including Weedon in Northamptonshire, Hanbury in Staffordshire, and either Threckingham in Lincolnshire or, alternatively, Trentham in Staffordshire. It was said that she was so pure and good that she could hang her veil on a sunbeam. She died at Threckingham, or Trentham, in around 700, and was buried at Hanbury at her own request. Saints were not canonised by the papacy until the 12th century, but it was still necessary for a saint to be verified by a bishop. The miracle that caused Werburgh to be recognised as a saint was an unusual one. Although there are a number of versions of the story, the differences are minor. One version says that St Werburgh had enjoyed watching a visiting flock of geese in a neighbouring meadow of the convent in which she was staying. One of them was particularly large and had a black ring of feathers around his neck. She became fond of him and called him Grey King. The convent steward, Hugh, had also noticed Grey King, but his interest had little to do with aesthetically pleasing plumage. Angry with the geese for devastating his field of corn, Hugh soon had Grey King in a pot and ate the offending bird. One version says that Werburgh was away when this happened, and when she returned, the remaining geese formed a delegation to inform her of the event and ask for her help. Werburgh acted immediately, ordering that the bones and feathers of the carcass should be gathered up. When she commanded the bones of the dead goose to rise again, they assembled themselves, and Grey King was reborn. 9 years after her burial, St. Werburgh's nephew Coelred, now King of Mercia, decided to move the saint to a less modest tomb in Hanbury. When she was removed from her coffin, she was found to be in whole and perfect form, a certain mark of sainthood. On the face of it, it is something of a puzzle that St. Werburgh, safely entombed in Staffordshire, should suddenly appear as the star turn in a secular monastery in Chester in the 10th century. The responsibility for this lies with the Queen of Mercia, Queen Aethelflaed. Maps of Britain in the latter half of the 9th century show the extent to which Danelaw had taken over huge expanses of the island. Much of what had been the kingdom of Mercia had been swallowed whole, leaving a much smaller kingdom abutting the powerful kingdom of Wessex. Marriage ties connected the two, but they were clearly under enormous pressure from the Scandinavian expansion. St. Werburgh never visited Chester during her lifetime, and her arrival in the Anglo-Saxon burh, or fortified settlement, in around 907, around 200 years after her death, requires another thread of history that starts, for the practical purposes of this presentation, with Alfred the Great, King of Wessex from 848 to 899. Alfred's daughter was the Princess Aethelflaed, who at the age of around 15 was married for political reasons to Aethelred, King of Mercia. Aethelflaed grew up in a time of disruption and war during the Viking incursions and the associated competition for territory. She was also familiar with the arts of diplomacy and negotiation. She was well suited for the role of Queen of Mercia. Although subordinate to her husband, with duties and responsibilities, she also had rights, privileges, and a position of respect that she clearly built on, being recognised as partner to her husband in many of their joint enterprises, including the establishment of new burghs at Worcester and Gloucester, whilst improving existing towns such as Hereford, Winchcombe, and even London. The years around the turn of the century must have been very trying for Aethelflaed. In 899, Aethelflaed's father, Alfred the Great, died on the 26th of October 899, and was succeeded as King of Wessex by his eldest son and Aethelflaed's brother, Edward the Elder. Edward was forced to fight off a counter-claim from his cousin Ethelwold. He was triumphant, but was forced to address the situation again in 902, when Ethelwold mounted another campaign against Edward, which was again repulsed. In the same year, Aethelflaed's mother died, probably in St. Mary's Abbey in Winchester. Just to pile on the pressure, a threat was made to the northwestern territory of Mercia at Chester. It was only now, when the vulnerability of the old Roman town threatened the security of the kingdom of Mercia, that it drew attention from King Ethelred and Queen Aethelflaed. In the last decade of his life, King Ethelred suffered a recurring illness, and he had succumbed to a bout of this affliction when Chester came under threat. Queen Aethelflaed therefore assumed authority during the crisis. In the 890s, Chester was described in the Anglo-Saxon charters as a deserted city in Wirral. It still had much of its Roman walls, but the interior was in ruins. Mercia had been a much larger and more powerful kingdom in its past, but the Viking Scandinavian invasions had taken control of the eastern reaches of the former kingdom. In the south, Wessex was the most powerful kingdom, whilst in the northeast the King of Northumbria still held land on the east half of the island, extending well into present-day Scotland. The Dane-controlled land ran down much of the east coast south of Northumbria, and there was a significant Scandinavian presence in Ireland. It was from Ireland that the threat to Chester emerged. In 902, the Irish kings formed an alliance to rid themselves of the Vikings, capturing Norse Dublin and forcing many to leave as groups of refugees in need of new lands to colonise. One of these refugees was Ingemund, who led one of these ousted groups on to Anglesey. Forcibly rejected by the Welsh, they followed the Dee inland towards Chester. According to one source, they requested a meeting with the Mercian royalty. With Ethelred still sick, Aethelflaed met with Ingemund, who proposed a peaceful solution to the dilemma. Aethelflaed was pragmatically willing to negotiate a home for them on the north of the Wirral Peninsula, perhaps believing that they might provide a protective buffer against other Viking interests seeking to find new territory to colonise. Here they could have lived in peace by farming and trading via the sea routes, but they had been settled for only a few years when Ingemund broke faith with Aethelflaed and began to amass troops. Hearing of the threat, Aethelflaed assembled forces of her own within the Chester walls. The town was besieged, but the Mercians emerged triumphant. In 907, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles say that Chester was restored or rebuilt, depending on the translation you use. This restoration work was usually credited to Aethelflaed. With Aethelred temporarily restored to health, the couple established Chester as a new burh within the 5-metre or 16-foot tall walls encompassing an area of 26 hectares, which is about 65 acres. Unfortunately, it has been impossible to determine which bits of the walls were repaired by Aethelflaed. Chester was far bigger than their previous burghs and represented a significant investment in the border town. The creation of a prominent settlement in a vulnerable border position needed to attract people, and this meant building features that were both familiar and desirable in other towns to bring people in. At the same time, Aethelflaed took the decision to move the relics of St Werburgh from Hanbury to Chester. The timing was probably driven by the threat to the relics of St Werburgh, Hanbury, by advancing Danish forces. This echoes Aethelflaed's earlier decision to move the relics of St Oswald from the lands under Danish occupation, which took place under similar circumstances. The decision to move St Werburgh to Chester may have been motivated also by the need to give Chester an authentic and stabilising Christian focus, with reassuring links back to a noble Mercian past. According to the St Werburgh monk Henry Bradshaw, writing in around 1513, but probably referencing much earlier sources, when the saint was removed to Chester, her body was found to be powder, which was seen not in negative terms, but as a divine miracle performed to protect the saint against pagans who were enemies to Jesus, unfaithful and untrue, to prevent the unholy corruption of her remains. Although there is no incontrovertible data to support the presence of a church on the site of St Werburgh's Abbey, there is a tradition that a wooden church dedicated to Saints Peter and Paul had been founded there by Aethelflaed's father, which would have housed the saint's remains. This church would have been rededicated to St Werburgh when the saint became resident. Archaeological excavations produced pre-Norman building materials, but it's not possible to assign an early 10th century date to them. Wherever the church was located, the patronage of the Queen ensured the initial success, and it received additional grants throughout the 10th century, including one from King Edgar in 958. The 1086 Domesday Survey records it as a monastery, indicating that the Anglo-Saxon St Werburghs had been upgraded from church to secular monastery sometime before that date. In 911, King Aethelred died of unknown causes, probably related to his recurring illness. He was buried in St Oswald's Priory in Gloucestershire. Aethelflaed was now in the position of having to make some important decisions. Many previous royal widows of the period had retired to a convent to live out the rest of their lives. There was plenty of precedent in Aethelflaed's own family for monastic service. One great-aunt was the founder of Ely Abbey, another was the founder of Minster in Sheppey, and Aethelflaed's own mother had retired on the death of her father to a nunnery, eventually becoming Abbess of Ely as well. Aethelflaed, however, took the reins of the Mercian government into her own hands, ruling as Lady of the Mercians. The church monastery of St Werburgh continued to house the saint's remains and seems to have survived the military action that took place in and around Chester following the conquest. In 1093, only 27 years after the Norman conquest, the abbey was refounded as an Anglo-Norman Benedictine abbey by the notorious knight and magnate Hugh d'Avranches, also known as Hugh Lupus, the Wolf. Hugh Lupus had been granted Chester as its first earl by William I and was one of the most powerful men in England. His appointment followed William I's vengeful retaliation against Chester for 2 rebellions which had left the city in disarray. Hugh's task was to ensure that the city remained docile after William departed, serving the Crown as the northernmost marcher town, a buffer zone between Wales and England, and an increasingly important commercial port. There were many possible reasons for landowners to found monastic establishments. Simple piety was one reason, as was social convention, as it was often seen as the duty of the nobility to promote religious houses. Political manoeuvring was another possible motivation. A particularly powerful motive was fear of the ever-approaching perils of the afterlife. Hugh's decision to refound the abbey was probably twofold. Whilst making a conspicuous contribution to a deeply resentful city for which he was now responsible and which he needed to maintain the peace, he was also looking after his own spiritual interests. He managed to secure one of the most high-status bishops in the country, Anselm, to come and supervise the project, and Anselm left his clerk Richard to become the first abbot. Hugh endowed his shiny new monastery with rich and prosperous lands to ensure its self-sufficiency. These were not merely charitable acts. Hugh was heading perilously towards the end of a far from virtuous life. Hugh Hicklin, writing in 1852, gives an evocative summary of the situation. Hugh Lupus, following the example of most of his predecessors, lived a life of the wildest luxury and rapine. At length, falling sick from the consequence of his excesses, and age, and disease coming on, the old hardened soldier was struck with remorse, and an expiation common enough in those days. The great Hugh Lupus took the cowl, retired in the last state of disease into the monastery, and in 3 days was no more. By founding a monastery and committing himself to a brief period as a monk at the last possible moment, Hugh attempted to provide himself with some afterlife insurance. The logic of this is somewhat difficult to compute today. Monks were considered to be closer to heaven than any other human on earth, and their prayers were thought to be heard with undiluted clarity by God. The idea of pleasing God by founding a monastery and then reaching closer to heaven by being buried within the monastic cloister seems suspiciously like inducement today, and one would have thought that God would have been wise to such manoeuvring. Given the sheer number of wealthy men and women founding abbeys and priories, however, this aspect of the matter does not appear to have occurred to them. Matters became much more contractual during the 11th century, when the idea of purgatory was disseminated to the public by the Church. This intermediate area between heaven and hell allowed redeemable sinners to suffer a hell-like experience to work off their crimes against Christianity before eventually entering heaven. From this time onwards, substantial efforts were made to negotiate for reduced time spent in purgatory. After the original endowment, the abbey continued to receive many properties over the centuries from wealthy local landowners and smaller gifts in the wills of those who were not quite so well positioned, all attempting to win the goodwill of the monks and through them the divine. Those with less purchasing power would not anticipate having the same negotiating power, but every contribution might help. In the process of all this human fear and negotiations to minimise the inevitable punishments after death, monasteries became substantially wealthy, some of the richest landowners in the kingdom. Land was not, however, their only form of income. Not all monasteries were lucky enough to secure the bones, blood, or hair of a saint that might attract pilgrims, but the Abbey of St Werburgh still retained the relics of St Werburgh after its rebuild in 1093. When a church or monastery contained the relics of a saint, the keepers of the relics could hope for the saint to demonstrate her sanctity by producing the occasional miracle. Neither Jocelyn de Saint-Bertin, writing in the 11th century, nor William of Malmesbury, writing in the 12th, were able to provide many details about the earlier miracles that St Werburgh was supposed to have performed at Chester, but William of Malmesbury has the following to say: "The merits of this virgin are proclaimed at Chester, and her miracles extolled. Although she is promptly favourable to the petitions of all, she is especially quick to give heed to the prayers of women and children." The girdle of St Werburgh, which was held by the abbey, was apparently particularly popular with pregnant women. In 1500, a monk at St Werburgh's Abbey wrote a life of St Werburgh, in which he credits her with a miracle on behalf of Richard, Earl of Chester, in around 1120. Richard made a pilgrimage to St Winifred's Well at Holywell in around 1120, but was attacked by hostile Welshmen and was forced to shelter at nearby Basingwork Abbey. Before William, Constable of Chester, set forth to search for the Earl, he prayed to St Werburgh, who parted the River Dee because no boat was available, permitting William and his men to walk across the riverbed and rescue the Earl. In another story, St Werburgh intervened during an unexpected Welsh attack on Chester. She blinded the attackers, forcing them to retreat. This military aspect to the saint is underlined by the tradition of taking the shrine on procession around the city when it was considered to be under threat, setting her down briefly on parts of the city walls. Nearly 250 years after Hugh's foundation, in around 1340, just before the Black Death, a new red sandstone shrine was built for the saint, an elaborate Gothic affair around 7 foot tall, built to look like a chapel. The new shrine, on 2 levels, contained whatever remained of the relics in the upper layer, whilst the lower layer was provided with niches into which pilgrims could fold themselves to get even closer to the spirituality of the saint. The top was decorated with statuettes for former Anglo-Saxon monarchs, most of whom are missing their heads today. Little carved animals formed a line around the middle, images of the natural world that were as much part of God's creation as people. Today, the only one of these natural world carvings left is a tiny dog scratching his ear with a hind leg. The shrine was also in all likelihood bedecked with elaborate precious stones, its architectural details finished in gold, as some of them are today. Although today it is located in the 13th century Lady Chapel, it was originally located in the easternmost bay of the presbytery behind the high altar. The relics of the saint were encased very safely within the very top of the shrine, but the spiritual power of the bones themselves emanated from the relics, permeating all the stone, so that touching the shrine was equivalent to touching the saint's essence. This was a powerful concept and a vibrant presence in the monastery. The substantial monument was a permanent fixture. There would be no carrying the shrine through the town in times of threat or stress. Monastic communities became more expensive as the centuries rolled forward, as the trappings of seclusion and self-denial fell away towards the 16th century. Monks needed to take ever more elaborate steps to making a living. The drain on monastic funds were many and varied. Guests, who were not expected to pay for their upkeep, were always a drain on popular monastic establishments, and alms to the poor still had to be paid. Expenses accrued from the management of extensive estates, including wages for bailiffs and labourers, repairs to buildings and boundaries, and the costs involved in agricultural production. Churches that had been appropriated by the monastery for their incomes still involved costs, including the provision of an incumbent priest. St Werburgh's was often involved in legal disputes with Chester citizens, and this too was costly. Abbots rolled out ambitious extension plans for the monastic church and required larger and more luxurious quarters, which included spaces where VIP guests could be lavishly entertained, costly vanity projects that formed part of their legacy. Provisions for monks and visitors became more luxurious and more expensive. The upkeep of a vast monastic architectural complex could be eye-watering, even without the occasional devastating fire or flood. Balancing the books was a constant headache for monastic establishments. By the later Middle Ages, when imaginative ways of generating income were increasingly critical to monastic well-being, pilgrims were a great way of generating income. Pilgrimages were usually journeys of meaning, sometimes deeply spiritual and personal, characterized by any number of aspirations, including cures for illnesses and defects, expressions of penitence, a wish to feel the presence of something holy, and the urge to give thanks for a prayer answered. But pilgrimages could also be time to enjoy feasts, fairs and markets, and as such were not merely pious and spiritual, but could be sociable and enjoyable liberation from the mundane. When pilgrims visited shrines, tombs and reliquaries to satisfy personal needs, the monastery expected pilgrims to show their gratitude to the saint and to heaven by gifting a contribution to the monastic coffers in the form of altarage. This was usually money, but sometimes took the form of valuable gifts. Clusters of shrines were good news for everyone. Pilgrims to a particular shrine would frequently do the rounds of all the other major religious sites and shrines in the immediate area, as well as those further afield in the region, soaking up all the divinity available. Some shrines were more revered than others and had great pulling power, which could generate satisfying levels of income. In Chester itself, St Werburgh's shrine was in competition with the miracle-performing Holy Rood, a sculpture of Christ on the cross in St John's the Baptist Church next to the amphitheatre, which was reputed to include a piece of the true cross, thought to have been found by the mother of the Emperor Constantine. It was installed in around 1250. St Werburgh became a secondary attraction after this date. The power of the crucifix of Christ himself was rather more compelling to pilgrims than an Anglo-Saxon saint. It was to the Holy Rood of St John's that Edward I took the nobility of Gwynedd to swear fealty before himself and before God. Further afield, it is also probable that many of the pilgrims visiting Chester were en route to both the Holy Well of St Winifred and the Cathedral of St Asaph. The latter contained the 6th century relics of the eponymous saint, renowned for his healing miracles. And St Werburgh's shrine at Holywell in northeast Wales was a particular attraction. The 7th century saint's remains had actually been removed from Wales to Shrewsbury in 1138, but Holywell was the site of the miracle in which she died by beheading and was brought back to life, the spring flowing into existence where her blood was spilled. The ownership of the splendid shrine alternated between the neighbouring Basingstoke Abbey and St Werburgh's Abbey, depending on whether the English or Welsh were in control of the area, and this represented a useful form of income for whichever abbey was in command of the beautiful shrine's resources. The nearby Cistercian monks of Basingstoke were in an excellent position for providing all the facilities that the pilgrims might need to make the most of the experience. Because pilgrims travel to specific shrines, it's easy to think of pilgrims exclusively in terms of destinations, but the act of making a pilgrimage was as much about the journey as the destination, and pilgrim routes could be both sociable experiences, shared with like-minded individuals, and essential to the spiritual character of the undertaking. As pilgrim routes became fixed in the religious round, they became special places in the landscape with identities of their own and features that singled them out as part of the greater network of pilgrim experiences. The east-west pilgrim route between Holywell and St Asaph was well known by the later medieval period, making use of the Diva, Varis, Canovium, Segontium, Chester Carnarvon Roman road, which was crossed by Offa's Dyke and took in the beautifully carved late 10th century cross, which still stands today. St Winifred's Well was 28 miles or 45 kilometres from Chester, and St Asaph's was 14 miles or 22 kilometres from Chester, and the two were 16 miles or 26 kilometres from each other, making this a viable circuit. Although St Werburgh's Abbey would undoubtedly have preferred to be the most important of the local shrines, and would have done its best to attract pilgrims, it certainly benefited from the proximity of more fashionable and perhaps more relatable pilgrim destinations nearby, and the network of routes that connected them. There are no records surviving from St Werburgh's to indicate what sort of income the monastery derived from pilgrims, but nearby St John the Baptist's Holy Rood was the second most important source of 3 primary sources of income for the church, amounting to in excess of £50 per annum in the 14th century. The National Archives currency converter equates this, for 1350, to £29,361 in modern money, or, for example, 72 horses or 135 cows. That's quite a lot of purchasing power. This is half the value of the nationally important Aethelfaed's shrine at Ely, which in 1408-9 earned £19, 9 shillings and 10 pence. And even that is a drop in the ocean to what St Thomas Becket's shrine could attract from both British and Western European pilgrims, £120 in 1411 and a staggering £360 in the Jubilee year of 1420, which equates today to around £231,483, which, for example, could have purchased 83 horses or 620 cows. St Winifred's Well earned an annual revenue by the time of the Reformation of £157, 15 shillings and 2 pence, which probably included the sale of indulgences. Alterage was also payable on feast days by anyone attending the celebration. For St Werburgh's, this day was the 3rd of February. Again, we have no records for St Werburgh's, but at Selby Abbey in Yorkshire, which held a shrine of Saint-Germain, the festival of the burial of the saint on the 1st of October in 1446 to 1447 earned the abbey 16 shillings and 8 pence, and the offerings for the festival of the death of the saint on the 31st of July earned them another 6 shillings. The money box of Saint-Germain accumulated £9, 14 shillings and 10 pence for the year. Again, these were useful contributions to an abbey's financial resources, amounting to £6,790 in modern money, which would have purchased 14 horses or 27 cows. St Werburgh's would have been a long way down the pilgrimage and alterage income scale, but the earnings would still have been valuable. Pilgrim badges are evidence for the personal link between a person and a shrine. Thousands of them have been found in Western Europe and are a clear indication of how personal and individual worship could be. Before badges were available, pilgrims might collect earth from around a shrine or chip off small pieces of the shrine itself. When low-cost badges became available, they were adopted with enthusiasm as satisfying and permanent mementos of a pilgrimage successfully undertaken. They first appeared during the 12th century. Decorated metal ampullae, too, were manufactured to hold liquids, but in smaller numbers. Wealthier pilgrims might order a custom-made item, which might be made of a more expensive material, but the less expensive materials are by far the most frequently represented in museum and personal collections. By the 15th century, they might cost as little as a penny for 12. One of the most appealing aspects of the pilgrim badges is that the majority that survive today were clearly made for those who did not have much surplus cash to spend on souvenirs, suggesting how important they were to the purchaser. The badges were cast in moulds, which have required careful crafting. The mould was usually made of stone, preferably limestone. A liquid alloy was poured into set, usually commingling lead with either pewter or tin. Lead was locally available and the other ores were inexpensive and could be imported. Once solidified, the object was removed from its mould, trimmed, polished, and was then ready to sell. The photograph on this slide shows one of Colin Turrod's stone moulds used in making St Werburgh pilgrim badges for Lionheart historical pewter replicas, which sells many replica pilgrim badges. The pilgrim badges were sold at the abbey gates or in stalls in market towns. If purchased before a visit to the shrine, the pilgrim badge could be touched to the shrine so it would permeate the badge itself with spiritual energy. As said earlier, it could then be dipped into a liquid to be swallowed as a health cure or rubbed into a wound as a salve. Given its portability, it could also be carried back to someone who was unfit to make the pilgrimage so that they could benefit from the power of the shrine. The pilgrim badges were usually worn with great pride, sewn onto items of outer clothing like hats or coats or on bags. Over time, as they became familiar and were transferred from old to new clothing, they probably became apotropaic, lucky talismans, as well as items of religious meanings. Sometimes they were pinned to walls of homes. The age of the monasteries ended with Henry VIII's abandonment of the papacy. This gave him enormous religious liberty, and one of his decisions was to close all of the monasteries, of all types, and carve up their buildings and estates for cash profit. The treasuries were bulging by the time he had finished. The only buildings to survive anything like intact became cathedrals. For most of them, the moment that the roof was stripped off of its lead and the interior was laid bare to the elements, the rest of the building began a long period of decay. Many were robbed for stone and used as building material. Some were converted for other purposes, such as farms and prestigious homes. Even where parts of a monastery might be preserved in this way, the bits that were excess to requirements were demolished. Although Henry VIII ordered the dissolution of St Werburgh's Abbey in 1536, its conversion into a cathedral saved it from the whole-scale destruction that occurred over an enormous geographical area. Henry VIII's withdrawal from the Catholic Church was only realistically viable because of a movement in Europe that challenged what it saw as the papal hierarchy's abuse of the core ideals of Christianity. In 1517, nearly 20 years before the dissolution, Martin Luther at the University of Wittenberg in Germany, disgusted by the financial corruption of the papacy and the clergy, began to promote the emergence of a more honest, less moderated religion in which men and women could worship in their homes as well as in their churches and build a more direct relationship with Christ and God. The existence of purgatory was rejected, and along with it the corrupt indulgences were eliminated. The appeal to saints for their intercession was deemed idolatrous, and religious images that had been the focal points of worship were condemned. The role of the clergy as a bridge between people and God was challenged. Religious revolution was taking place throughout Western Europe, and Henry VIII leapt on the timely bandwagon. In England, the reform movement was politically and socially necessary, both to usher in Henry's new era and to avoid the new religious house being labelled heretical. As part of the reforming quest to find a purer and more honest religious realm, effigies and saints were to be removed with extreme prejudice. The 14th century shrine of Werburgh really did not stand a chance. The shrine was dismantled and parts were used to build a tomb for the first bishop. Although Chester Cathedral retained most of its key components, the shrine was one of the first casualties. Later, in 1635, elements were incorporated into a throne for the latest bishop and is shown on this slide. The conversion of the monastery to a cathedral ensured the survival of the building in the early 16th century. By the 19th century, it required some conservation work, and this was translated into a lot of building work at the cathedral. When some pieces of the shrine were rediscovered in the period, Sir Arthur Blomfield attempted a reconstruction, which is what stands in the Lady Chapel today. The small statues of the Saxon kings do survive, but nearly all of their heads are missing. Of the little natural world figures that adorned it, only a dog scratching its ear with a hind leg now survives. Just as one expects pilgrims to travel, one expects pilgrim badges to travel. Marjorie Kemp, early in the 14th century, wife, mother of 14 children, visionary and pilgrim, managed to fit in pilgrimages to the Holy Land via Italy, to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, and to Danzig in Prussia. We have no idea where the owner of the St. Werburgh badge may have worn it on his or her travels, but it is not at all surprising to find that it ended its travels in London. There's one last thread to the story. According to the British Museum's records, in 1836, it purchased the badge shown at the beginning of this presentation from one Henry or Harry Osborne Cureton, who conducted his trade in London variously as a curiosity dealer, a medallist and a coin dealer. In February 1851, in the edition of the Athenaeum, an advert was placed announcing that Cureton's entire stock was being sold off due to his retirement. The British Museum's webpage about Harry Cureton suggests that after this he may have been employed, but in some capacity at the museum. If the British Museum was one of the buyers of the collection advertised in the Athenaeum, Cureton may have been hired to catalogue the objects, of which the St. Werburgh pilgrim badge may have been one. The badge is not on display at the British Museum, which is a shame, but not terribly surprising. As the British Museum's fact sheet explains, its collection totals at least 8 million objects, of which roughly 80,000, or 1%, are on public display at any one time, the rest remaining in storage. This post started with an image of geese in a basket, an emblem of St. Werburgh that was cast and sold to pilgrims as a totem of their enterprising pilgrimage to the shrine of a Mercian princess, St. Werburgh, within the abbey at Chester. By exploring the connection between a 7th century saint who was buried in Staffordshire and a 10th century Mercian queen, who transferred the remains of the saint to Chester, we encounter the Viking colonisation of Britain. The new shrine containing the saint's relics in Chester was a powerful new emblem of Christian faith, using affinity to the early Anglo-Saxon past to provide meaning and reassurance in the very turbulent present. In 1093, when Hugh Lupus, the first Earl of Chester, decided to put his stamp on Chester and, at the same time, pave his way to a comfortable afterlife by founding an impressive Benedictine monastery, the saint was provided with a new home, echoing Aethelflaed's own intentions. St. Werburgh's original Anglo-Saxon shrine was built to evoke both past and present, using history to provide a sense of continuity and stability as Chester entered a new era. Some of this sense of the present being reinforced by the past was carried forward into the 14th century shrine as well. St. Werburgh went on to generate income for the monastery throughout the Middle Ages. A pilgrim badge, even if it was mass-produced and relatively inexpensive, was an attractive symbol and one to wear with pride, but was not merely an inanimate souvenir. By touching it to the shrine, it became a conduit of spirituality, transmitting the essence, goodness, and potentially curative powers of the saint within. In an era in which Christ was universally accepted as being embedded in the Eucharist via transubstantiation, a church-given reality, the idea of objects like pilgrim badges as agents of transformation was not a theoretical matter, but another everyday Christian reality. Intrinsically, the badge had an active, multifunctional role as a medium of the shrine's essence and as a symbol of hope, piety, charity, perseverance, and/or status. The medieval period offered pilgrims a fluid, multi-layered religious existence in which, if they were deserving, the secular and spiritual could mingle in certain places under certain conditions. In a sense, whilst the shrine cannot be divided and shared, the pilgrim badge, the emblem of the shrine, and sometimes the vessel holding the essence of the shrine, is a way of dividing the shrine infinitely amongst those who invested it with their beliefs and hope. The static 14th century shrine and the multiple travelling pilgrim badges were firmly linked, the shrine unmoving, connected to a long distance Anglo-Saxon past was rooted to its particular spot. The pilgrim badges, by contrast, were all about the here and now, both for the craftsmen who made them and for the visiting pilgrims who purchased them. The shrine would have existed without the pilgrim badges, but the badges were dependent on both the shrine and the pilgrims. Whilst the memory was alive, the badge containing the memory remained connected to the shrine via the pilgrim. The shrine, acting as the anchor for such experiences, stayed firmly put, but its tendrils extended into the secular world via the tales told by the pilgrims who had visited, encouraging others to replicate the experience. At some point, the pilgrim badge was separated from the pilgrim. Perhaps the pilgrim died and it was inherited by one of his or her children. Later in its history, it encountered another point of departure and re-entered into the world of commercial transactions. Eventually, it found its way into the ownership of a dealer in portable objects like medals and coins, and in the 1860s was accessioned into the collection of the British Museum, where it is now buried in storage. Perhaps one day it will emerge to perform a role as a piece of valued heritage, but for the time being, it is divorced from any of the realities that it once served. My sincere thanks for listening, and please find the sources for this presentation on the following slides. Thanks a lot. Bye bye now.